We'll begin episode 2 where part 1 leads off in just a minute. When we last left the Misfits, they were told by their manager, Eric, that something must be done about the record company since it's in danger of losing money. Unless, as Eric said in his case, they can change their ways or else pay the consequences. So after Eric had left Harvey's office, he was left with no choice but to sell everything he owns, his house, his car, his furniture, and everything else. So when both Jerrica and Eric went to the nightclub later and met up with the Stingers, Riot, Minx, and Rapture, Riot agrees to discuss some business matters with Eric first at the Gabor estate and then meets up with Jerrica later at the Starlight Mansion. So while the Holograms are at the introduction at the Rock Hard Cafe a little bit later to be inducted into the Wall of Fame, that's when the fight started happening between Rio and Riot of the Stingers. And that's when both Riot and Jim left. And then after that, they went to the Harp Cliff. So that's where episode 2 picks up where part 1 leaves off. As you can also recall back in part 1, Rio and Minx went looking for Riot and Jim everywhere. As for Rapture and Possess of the Misfits, they went back to the Gabor mansion. But let's get back to Jim and Riot for a minute. After their kiss, that's when Jim told Riot that she cannot go into Riot's infatuation because she told him that she has feelings for someone else, and that would be Rio. That's true, Riot says, but don't you get it? We belong together. We have a lot in common. We're perfect for each other. I think we need to leave, Jim said, and so she ran off. But Riot catches up with her. So Jim told Riot, I thought you're here to discuss an offer from Jerrica herself. Well, Riot says, if it pleases you so, I'll be more than happy to contact her myself, Riot suggested. So they both got into the Glitter and Gold Roadster and they left together. So now in the Glitter and Gold Roadster, Riot says, but just promise me one thing that we'll see each other again sometime, Riot explains. Not only did Jim agree, but then asked Riot a question, how can I refuse? Now back with Rio and Minx, now remember, since back in part 1, they went looking for Jim and Riot everywhere. Now you can tell that Rio's getting really annoyed with Minx. It says that's the sixth nightclub we've been to, and we still haven't found them. Riot and Jim, that is. So just like what Riot did to Jim back in part 1, it's now Minx's turn to make a move on Rio, but Rio refused. So Rio agrees to take Minx home, but Minx refused and then told Rio, you can take yourself back. And before she got into the cab, that's when Rio got into the van, ignoring her threat to plead her case, Minx that is, to tell him, you'll never win Jim back, do you hear me? But Rio chose to ignore Minx. Later, back at the Gabor mansion with the Misfits, and of course Rapture of the Stingers. Now remember, Possess and Rapture had left the Hard Rock Cafe since part 1, and now Possess is pacing back and forth, wondering where Riot went, and that he should have came back. So Rapture of the Stingers told Possess of the Misfits to say, listen to me, I have a plan, but you have to do as I tell you to do. Of course, Possess said, I'll do anything. Now listen, here's how you'll win Riot over Jim, to get him away from her. But then Stormer, who made a dismissal of Rapture's claims, and then told Possess of the Misfits, forget it, she can't help you. But, however, in anger, Possess decided to shove Stormer away from her. So after Janet and Roxy helped up Stormer, Possess makes her case with her bandmates to say, just you wait, I'll win Riot back, you'll see. So Possess told her bandmates to, quote, mind their own business and stay out of her affairs, and Rapture happens to agree with her. So both of the women head upstairs. So later in the upstairs bedroom, you can tell that Possess does not like the outfit that Rapture picked out for her, and said in her case that it made her look ridiculous. Then Rapture says, true, but it gives the innocence that Riot needs. Now all we need is some love potion, Rapture said, and so both of the women left the upstairs bedroom. So, in the kitchen downstairs, Rapture is making a special love potion for Possessed of the Misfits, in a blender, of course. So, after the potion was finished, Rapture needed a special kind of powder, but it's really just salt. But Possess doesn't know it yet. So, Rapture, after she finished making that potion, is now up to Possess to drink it. And so she did. Now, you can tell that after Possess drank that kind of potion, she doesn't feel very well. But Rapture and Possess were not aware that Stormer, Roxy, and Jetta had listened to the entire thing, but they didn't know it yet. After the three of the misfits had peeked from the kitchen and saw what happened, they knew something was off. So Roxy goes first to say that Rapture is treating Possess like a puppet, to say the least. Then Stormer made the case to ask the question, are you thinking what I'm thinking? I think Possess is sick. I agree, Jess says. She's sick, all right. Love sick. So we go into the entire montage of Love Sick by the Misfits. So after the song came to an end, Jenna says that she couldn't take it anymore, and neither did Stormer and Roxy. And since Possess will never listen to them anyway, so it's now up to them to take matters in their own hands. So they left the Gabor mansion. Remember Minx that was dumped by Rio? She took the cab back to the Gabor mansion, and she accidentally ran into three of the misfits on her way in, while the three of the misfits were on their way out. So meanwhile, in the upstairs bedroom with Possess and Rapture, that's when Minx shows up minutes later to join up with Rapture, and then asks her, "What are you doing?" "I'm painting symbols on Possess's face," Rapture explains. So Minx happens to agree with Rapture. So after Possess was finished, she stood up, crossed her legs, her arms, her eyes, and closed them, and repeated just the way that Rapture said to do. And that's when minutes later, Riot shows up. At first, Possess thought that Riot would never notice her until seconds later when he approached Possess. He says, "You do look great." So Riot told his bandmates before leaving the room, "I must speak to you in private at once," and so the Stingers left. Later, at the Starlight Mansion's living room, here you see Riot pacing back and forth, worrying about Jim and Riot, and told Jim's friends that if they're not back soon, that he'll call the police. Now, Shayna, being supportive as she is, tells Rio, "Now, I know you're getting worried, and so are we, but there's no need to jump to conclusions." Then minutes later, Jim shows up. Well, Rio was more than happy to see Jim. But Rio goes first to speak in his case to say, "We were worried about you. What happened?" Then it's Jim's turn to plead her case. "Why should you be worried? I can take care of myself." Then Rio goes next to speak in his case to say, "I don't like Riot at least a bit, and especially what he's doing to you lately." Then Jim speaks in her case to say, "Well, in your case, at least Riot treats me the exact same way as I treated him, and then he accepts me for what I am." So then Sheena tries to calm down both Jim and Rio and begs them to please don't say something you'll regret later. Then Jimmy looked at Rio and says, "After all, Ryan and I are only discussing business matters, that's all." "I mean, think about it," Jim says. "It's not like he's going to be moving in next door." But then the doorbell rang. It's the Stingers. Then Riot, the leader of the Stingers, said to Jim, "Gee, what a surprise. I didn't expect to see you this quick so soon." That's because the Misfits didn't know that just moments ago they had just left the Gabor mansion. Now you can tell that Rio and Jim's bandmates don't like it at least a bit. Anyway, Riot just told Jim, "We're here to discuss some matters on the behalf of Jerrica." Then Riot says, "Even better, we're moving in." So you know what this means. For Rio and the holograms, this could mean a serious problem. So Rio goes up to Riot of the Stingers and said in his case that he's got a lot of nerve showing up unannounced like that. "Well, in your case," Riot says, "I was invited, remember? Unless, of course, if you want Jim to have us move back with Eric and the Misfits, of course." When Jim heard that, she was like, "Oh, no way!" Then Jim told Riot that if it happens, that Jerrica will never forgive her for it. Minx of the Stingers, meanwhile, tries to impress Rio the best way she knew how. And she says it's nice to see you again. But just like in part one, Minx has been rejected. So Rio showed you around, right? That's what Jim was asking Minx. Actually, he shows me every nightclub there was, Minx says. But Rio pleaded his case to say that's not exactly so. Then Joan told Rio that there's no need to owe her any explanations whatsoever. In my case, Jim said, if you're free to do what you want, then so would I. So Jim agrees to show the singers to the upstairs guest room. As you may have guessed it, Rio's not exactly happy about it, and so he walked out. Then Asha looked at Shayna and says, uh-oh, you know what this means? These stingers are going to be a problem for us. I have a bad feeling about this. So the next morning at the Gabor mansion, when the mistress came back with Eric, I guess they must have told him that something was off with Possess. I can't say for sure. So by the moment they arrived, so after the butler went ahead and let them in, so Eric looks at Roxy and says, I don't know what you're talking about. She looks fine to me. Then when Possess goes downstairs to meet up with Eric, she says, it's good to see you, and kisses Eric on the cheek. And then he looks at Roxy and says, I think you're right. Something is up with her. So Eric says, I'm here to see the Stingers about their deal. They haven't come downstairs yet, Possess says, but what Eric and Possess are not aware of, by the time that the mistress came back, the Stingers had already left to the Starlight Mansion, but they didn't know it yet. So everyone went upstairs, and when Possess knocked on the door to the guest room, it was empty by the time that Possess arrived inside, and so was the other guest room. So when Eric and the mistress shows up minutes later, that's when Possess knew the Stingers had already left since the previous night, and they were at Starlight Mansion. So Eric says, what's going on here, Possess? Well, no matter, Eric says, because he tells Possess that he has a plan to launch a frontal attack, if you will. We need something spectacular, something that will grab Riot's attention. Of course, Possess agrees with Eric. Well, now that everybody went back downstairs, just when Eric was about to discuss a plan with Roxy, but Roxy says, wait a minute, who said we're going to help her? Even Jetta agrees with Roxy and said to Possess, we need to talk about this right now. Then Stormer pleaded her case to say to Possess that this nonsense has got to stop right this minute. So what the Misfits are telling Possess that she has a choice, them or Riot of the Stingers. So Eric, who agrees with three of the Misfits, told Possess, yes, Possess, what's your decision? Riot of the Stingers or your group mates? Well, Possess said to Eric, I guess I have to choose Riot of the Stingers instead of them. Well, that did it. Stormer, Roxy, and Jetta had reached their limit and told their former leader, well, in that case, you can kiss this group goodbye. And so they left the Gabor mansion. Later, back at Starlight Mansion, after the Stingers had spent the night in the upstairs guest room, they went downstairs, and that's when they were greeted by the Starlight Girls. Chrissy, Terry, Bonnie, Ashley, Annie, Jolene, who's one of Dondra's sisters, they were asking Riot of the Singers to give them each an autograph. But then minutes later, Jerrica comes in to tell the girls to calm down. So Riot wants to know from Jerrica what's going on. So Jerrica, the first thing she did was to apologize to Riot that she didn't get a chance to introduce herself the other night. But at any rate, Jerrica says, meet the Starlight Girls. And so all at once the Starlight Girl said, nice to meet you, can we have your autograph, and etc. But Riot declined, then looked at Jerrica and said that he's not interested in giving the Starlight Girls the autographs at the moment. As long as they, the singers, are being left alone in a way. And so after that, Riot and his bandmates head off. So in the living room, here you see Riot sitting in a chair, reading a magazine. That was until minutes later, Ashley of the Starlight Girls shows up and says, I thought you'd be thirsty, so I brought you something to drink. But by accident, she tripped over a stuffed toy that causes Ashley to spill the drink on Riot's jacket. Well, that kind of accident just made Riot upset. Ashley apologized, and then when Riot took his jacket off, he says, Never mind, I'm not going to wear it again anyway, and just throws the jacket on the floor. Ashley, who is now annoyed, just told Riot of the Stingers, I was just trying to be friendly, so she walked off. Then it's Asha's turn to make a suggestion. I can wash this jacket for you. It'll be like new again. But Riot declined and then told Asha, when a perfect guy handles his possessions like that, a guy like myself shouldn't be tolerated for imperfection in the way, he explains. So Asha heads off with Riot's jacket. Minx, meanwhile, was looking at Chrissy at the Starlight Girls and the painting that she did. After Minx looks over at Chrissy's painting, she pleaded her case to say how terrible it looked. Well, gee, it looked all right to me. At least that's what I thought, Chrissy said to Minx. Well, Minx just insulted Chrissy by saying that she has no talent whatsoever and threw Chrissy's drawing on the floor. Now, Chrissy being all upset, she ran off. And when Rhea saw what had happened and asked Minx how could you be so cruel to Chrissy and that she were so hard on that painting. In response, Minx pleaded a case for Rhea to ask a question. What do you Americans know about talent anyway? And so she heads off. Meanwhile, Terry of the Starlight Girls was all by herself, but not for long. But that's when Rapture of the Stingers shows up minutes later. So what Rapture did is that she decided to scare Terry of the Starlight Girls by claiming the case that Rapture will turn into a werewolf when the moon is full and etc. Well, that did it. That made Terry frightened and upset. On Terry's way out, she bumped into Shayna of the holograms who heard what was going on. So Shayna asked Terry what's going on, and then Terry explained to Shayna how Rapture would be turned into a werewolf and etc. Why did you scare her like that? Sheeta asked Rapture. Well, instead of telling the truth, that's when Rapture claimed a case to say that she and Terry of the Starlight Girls were just playing a game. So meanwhile in the rehearsal room, the holograms can tell that they just couldn't take it anymore. So Rhea goes first to say that Minx is just as controlling and obsessive as Riot is. And of course, Shayna, who agrees with Rhea, and said that so was Rapture. Anyway, Asha said that something must be done about it, and so all four of the girls went to the backyard. So meanwhile there, so while the stingers are relaxing in the pool, that's when the holograms show up. Rhea goes first to tell Riot what an egotistical, controlling, conniving human being he is. Well, his bandmates on the other hand, as Rhea says in her case, they're a bunch of snobs. Well, we are what we are, Riot said. So Mingsu agrees with Riot of the Stingers to say to the holograms to neither take it or leave it. Well, speaking of which, we go into the entire montage of the Stinger song itself, Take It or Leave It. It was during the entire song that Terry of the Starlight Girls was being frightened to death by Rapture when turning into a werewolf, and every time Terry would get scared, she'll run into Shayna. Next, we see Minx of the Stingers tearing up the paintings that Chrissy of the Starlight Girls did. So when Rhea came in to defend Chrissy and her talent as an insult, that's when Minx decided to paint the lips of both Rhea and Chrissy. Finally, when the song came to an end, the last thing we see was three of the holograms, Asha, Shayna, and Rhea, being pushed into the pool by the Stingers themselves. So after that, they head off. The Stingers, that is. So, Riot went to see Jerrica in her study room, and Riot was looking at the contract. And so what Jerrica wants to know from Riot of the Stingers, why he's acting this way. Well, Riot said in his case that he's here to do business with Jerrica, not to do some catering. So Riot of the Stingers wants to know from Jerrica, where did Jim go? What happened? Well, Jerrica told Riot of the Stingers that unfortunately Jim's at band practice at the moment, but she'll be showing up later. Then, after looking after Jerrica's proposal, He says, "Now don't take it wrong. Your generous offer is indeed honest enough. But unfortunately, Eric is the better offer than yours." "Well, that may be true. Eric can promise you the world and all," Jerrica says, "but his deal is not as good as mine." So what Jerrica is telling Riot of the Stingers that he can get a much honest and of course suitable deal that's better than Eric's. So Riot tells Jerrica, "Let me be alone with this contract for a while so I can think it over." And so she walked out. And so when she met up with the girls in the hallway later, Jerrica tells her friends that there's something off with him, and she just doesn't understand. And then she says, "I think we have a problem here. When I'm Jim, he was controlling, manipulative, and conniving. But when I'm Jerrica, he was calm and in control." When Riot of the Stinger shows up minutes later, he told Jerrica and the girls, "Listen, I thought about your offer, and I read your contract very carefully." But then, when Ray was about to plead his case to tell Jerrica that if signing up with Starlight Music would make Jim happy and etc., he hears the noise coming from outside. But Ray is not the only person who heard it. Jerrica and the girls heard it too. So when they stepped outside Starlight Mansion, they couldn't believe it. There's a bunch of Stingers fans, elephants, and there's a car that's coming towards Starlight Mansion. And look who's inside of the car. It's Eric. But Eric's not alone because Pizzazz of the Misfits is there too. So Jerrica told Eric in her case to go away because she said that he's been trespassing. "Not so fast," Rice says. "I want to hear what Eric has to say." So when Eric steps out of the car, in his hand was a poster. So when he approached Riot of the Stingers, he said, "I got some good news for you and your bandmates." Well, Eric got Rice's attention all right, and of course Rice seems impressed with it. So Jerrica looked at Riot and says, "Whatever you do, please don't give in to this foolish nonsense of glitter and flashy stuff." So Eric told Jerrica, "I'll do more than that," because he said to Riot of the Stingers when he handed the poster to Riot for him to look at it, and when Riot looked at the poster, it's a picture of Stinger Sound Record Company. "Think about it," Eric said to Riot of the Stingers. "If you sign with me, we can make Stinger Sounds the most successful record company there is. Even better, I'll give you half of it." When Riot looks at the poster very carefully, and so did his bandmates, he says, "Wow, this is a better deal that even I couldn't refuse." Then Riot looks at Jerka and said, "Unless you want to match this kind of deal." So Riot asked Jerka a question: "Would you consider me if you would give me half of the deal for Starlight Music?" And Jerka said, "Really?" So Riot says, "Well, what's your decision?" So Kimber goes first to beg her sister to say, "Don't do this." "Well, you know our feelings," Rhea says, "but it is your company after all." So now at last, Jerka had her eyes closed, knowing what's going to happen if she signs half of Starlight Music to Riot. So finally, ashamed with regret, she says, "I'm sorry, Riot, but the answer is no. I can't." So yes, sadly for Jerka, Riot decided to side with Eric Raymond instead of with her. And now she's ashamed with regret and guilt for making this terrible choice. But in Jerka's case, it's all for the best anyway. So back at Starlight Music's upstairs office, Jerka just told Rio the bad news because now thanks to Eric, Riot has signed up with him rather than her. After Rio had heard the bad news, Rio told Jerka in a supportive way that signing up with the Stingers could have meant a lot for Starlight Music and its money. Well, too bad. But at least Rio is being supportive with Jerka to say, "At least there are other bands that could sign up with you instead." Then suddenly the phone rings. It's Riot at the Stingers coming from the upstairs office in the now Stinger Sounds office. So Riot wants to know from Jerka, "What happened? Did you change your mind?" "Unfortunately, no," Riot says, "but there is only one person that can change my mind, and that would be Jim." So Riot wants to know from Jerrica if she can arrange for Jim to meet him at the Wind Harp in 1 hour. So Jerrica says, okay, she'll meet you there. And so she heads off, leaving Rio all by himself in the upstairs office at Starlight Music. So meanwhile, at the Windhard Cliff, now remember that was the same Windhard Cliff that Riot and Jim had been to since the night before. So when Riot and Jim both arrived at the same time, so Jim says, I came as soon as I heard from Jerrica, and I'm here to warn you. Please don't trust that creep Eric Raymond. He's manipulative. He's cruel. And Riot says, oh? And you don't think that I'm aware of that? As a matter of fact, Riot says, I don't like or even trust Eric. Also, as Riot says in his case, that he understands clearly just what kind of a guy that Eric is. And besides, as Riot says in his case, that he can control Eric just the way he wanted it. Well, Jim says, then I guess we have nothing to speak of. There's nothing to discuss with. Well, then I guess there's only one thing left to do, Riot says. I need your decision now, to be at my side. That's the only thing that will make me change my mind. So, just like what Riot did the night before, he tried to persuade Jim in joining his cause instead of Rio. Because, as Riot says in his case, I'm not going to rest until you're by my side. But then, Rio shows up minutes later and then told Jim to make her choice between Riot and him. But before that could happen, Riot goes first to speak in his case to tell Rio that you have interfered in our business for the last time. Then it's Rio's turn to plead his case to say, I'm not here for that. Then Rio said that he has a message for Jim. He says, Jim, I know you can hear me. I'm here to tell you this. If you're here to stay with me, then I'll support you all the way. No doubt about it. But if you choose to be with Riot, then you'll never see me again. I'll leave. When Jim heard that, she tries to run to catch up with him. So Riot says, forget it, just let him go. You're staying with me. But Jim says, no, let me go. Don't you understand? Rio needs me. So Riot kisses Jim for the last time. So as a final insult, she decides to flip out, slap Riot in the face, and then tries to run to catch up with Rio. But she failed miserably. So speaking of which, back with Rio, he's now at the ruins of what was left of the Starlight House that has been burnt down since 2 seasons ago. Well, that and the Starlight Treehouse. That was until suddenly Rio just heard the voice of Jim calling his name. But before Rio can plead a case, Jim goes first to apologize because she says that she couldn't stand losing him over Riot. Then she saw the other side of Riot that she's never recognized. Then she saw what a conniving, conceited fool he's been. No wonder Jerrica turned him down. Well, that and the record deal that Jerrica could have had with Riot if it wasn't for that creep Eric Raymond. So Rio not only forgives Jim, but he said that losing her to Riot would be the worst thing that he'll ever do. And so both Jim and Rio have made up with a kiss. Back at Stinger's Sound in the upstairs office, so it was there that Riot just signed a deal with Eric Raymond. So you've heard right. The Stingers now have a record company of their own. Behind Riot was Possessed of the Misfits. Then Minx and Rapture shows up minutes later. Rapture goes first to ask him what's wrong. I thought you'd be happy. We won the record deal. True, we've won the record deal, Riot said. But unfortunately, I'll never rest until Jim is by my side. So what Riot says in his case that until Jim is rightfully his, the war itself will never be over. In fact, the battle was just the beginning. Anyway, long story short, Eric told Riot, well, there's only one thing left to do. It's to get the Misfits together again. So listening to Eric's advice, Riot decided to tell Pizzazz of the Misfits if she could do a favor for him to get the Misfits together again. And so she agrees. So meanwhile at the Phillips residence, well, however, the three of the Misfits are very miserable. They just don't sound the same without Possess. But then when Possess shows up minutes later, Roxy apologized for accidentally poking her in the eye. However, Pizzazz came to apologize to the Misfits to say, listen, we're just not the same. If you would come back with me, then we could be successful as we once were. So what do you say? Will you forgive me? Not only did the mistress forgive Princess, but they agreed to not only welcome her back, they also agreed to sign up with the Stingers at Stinger Sound. Back at Starlight Mansion, the holograms were happy to see that Rio and Jim came back, but they also made up as well. So we go through the entire song of Now by the holograms, the Misfits, and the holograms. It was during the entire song that the Stingers not only have a record company of their own, thanks to that creep Eric Raymond, Jerrica, alias Jim, now makes up with Rio and her bandmates, and as for the Misfits, they became four once again now that they have Pizzazz back. So Riot was right in his case. The battle is far from over. So you know what this means. It's a three-band rivalry. So when the song came to an end, well, there's going to be the biggest band battle in history. So that ends episode 2 and part 2.